Amen. Uh, I'm going to ask you a question this morning, a question that may make some of you a little bit embarrassed, but we'll not worry about that too much. I wonder how many, and I'm looking around the screens as I ask this question, how many of you talk to yourself? How many of you talk to yourself? One, two hands up, three hands up, young hands and old hands all got up here. Uh, right, everybody has basically put their hands up now. That's great, and Noah as well. We all at times probably talk to ourselves, and I wonder as you talk to yourself, what in what way do you talk to yourself? Some people talk to themselves in a very encouraging way as they're talking to themselves. They're talking, saying, "Yes, come on, I can do this. Let's go." Some people not so much. Some people, as they talk to themselves, talk in a way that is telling themselves off and say, why would you do that? That was a silly thing to do right there." Something along these lines. But I wonder, to make it a little bit more interesting this morning, I wonder, has anyone ever caught you talking to yourself? Uh, some smiles on some screens. Yes, some people have been caught in the middle of talking to themselves. Once, just a little brief story. Once someone called me on my phone. They called me by accident, and I caught them and listened to a good part of their conversation as they were talking to themselves on the other side of the phone by accident. But as we come to this Psalm 42 this morning, we come and listen to someone who really is talking to themselves. Or at least that's what it feels like for them, because they feel alone, they feel lonely, they feel isolated. And he's speaking, he's pouring out his soul, he's pouring out himself to God this morning. But really, he feels so lonely that he feels like he's talking to himself. But we'll see that as he talks to himself, we'll see that he has something very important to share with us, something very important to help us in difficult times of life. As we begin Psalm 42 this morning, we begin by meeting a man who has been torn away from the communal worship of God. He's been torn away from the temple and the routine of worship and the routine of coming before God in the temple. We come before a man, or we come to hear a man who is isolated in exile because he's been brought to a foreign land, and he's alone, and he's despairing there in that land. And for him, it feels as he's been torn away from the temple, as he's been torn away from temple worship in Israel, it feels as if he's been torn away from God himself. And in the first three verses, we read this man's lament as he talks to himself, as he pours out his heart there on his own, and to some degree. We read his lament: "As the deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God." Just for a moment in your mind's eye, I want you to imagine yourself in the middle of a desert. So for some of us, this might be harder than others, but just imagine for a moment that you're in the middle of a desert, and there's no stream, there's no brook, there's no real source of water, and you're traveling for a long period of time. And then you come to a little source of water. The water may be even dirty, but it doesn't matter, because it's some sort of nourishment for you. And as you get this little drink of water, the refreshing sip of water is as perfect, as pure, as worth life itself. That's the idea that the psalmist is coming from here, as he says, "As the deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God." The psalmist, though, he feels like he can't even get a sip of the refreshment which he seeks. As he likens that deer who pants for water, as he likens that as his experience, as he's looking for God. You see, this psalmist, he understands, and what he's talking to himself about is the fact that God is the source of nourishment of his life. God is the thirst quencher and the refreshing sip of pure water. that will quench his dryness, his drought, his loneliness, his despair. The obvious question, as the psalmist says, that he thirsts for God. The obvious question that we must reflect on this morning in our own lives is, do we thirst for God? Do we thirst for God? And we'll be coming back to this question at the end after we have considered the first 5 verses. We're only looking really at verses 1 to 5 this morning as we look at this psalm. But we look at it with that question in mind. Do you thirst for God? Jesus, as he begins his sermon in Matthew 5, he says these words: "Blessed is he who hungers and thirsts after righteousness." You see, as we come to this psalm this morning, as we come and we see this man with an appetite for God, as C.S. Lewis called it, we come and we realize that there is a danger even in the Christian life. There's a danger that even Christians can fall into a lack of desire for the nearness of God. Even Christians can fall into the danger of having a lack of wanting to be close to God. And maybe that's where you find yourself this morning. As you come to this psalm, as we come to worship God together this morning, maybe God to you is more like an old friend from whom you've grown apart, who has become more like an acquaintance who maybe you catch up with now and again, but there's no real thirst or desire to spend time with God. There's no real thirst or desire to grow closer to God. And maybe that's your experience this morning. Well, the point of this psalm and the point that the psalmist is making, and the reminder that this psalmist would bring us, is that God, and this is very clear, God, and we must understand that God alone is the very source of our lives. He's the very source of our lives. And here the psalmist says that his soul longs for that sense of closeness to his Creator. His soul longs for closeness to his Creator. His soul longs for God in the same way as the deer needs water for survival. The idea here is that without water, listen to this carefully, the deer will die. Without water, the deer will die. And that is the seriousness. That is how strong the sense of longing for God is for the psalmist. And that's how strong the sense of longing must be for God in our lives too. Blessed is he who hungers and thirsts after righteousness. But he says, the psalmist here, he says that his soul longs for God. His soul longs for God. As I read that, as Melanie has read that for us, what do you hear when you hear that the psalmist's soul longs for God? What do you hear? You see, to us here in 2021, we tend to compartmentalize ourselves into, I suppose, different aspects of our being, our body and our soul. They're two, we think here in Northern Ireland, here in the West, of these being two very distinctive and different things. The soul is the spiritual part of us, the body is the physical part of us, and the two, they don't really have much interaction with each other. They don't really have much relevance to each other. And here in 2021, we treat the body and soul as very distinct things, very distinct aspects of ourselves. One poet of the last century wrote, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." And sometimes we can think in this way about ourselves. Body is body and soul is soul, and never the two shall meet. But as the psalmist talks of the soul, his understanding would have been more akin to talking of the whole person. As the psalmist refers to the soul here, he wouldn't understand, or he wouldn't think about it in the same distinctive ways as maybe we would. No. Everything in the psalmist, as he says, his soul longs for God. Everything within him, spiritual, physical, everything longs for the very presence of God. Indeed, for the living God, as he calls him in verse 2. Matthew Henry very helpfully says and comments on these verses, living souls can never take up their rest anywhere short of the living God. And that's why the psalmist's soul is in anguish here. He feels as if he has been ripped away from God, because he cannot come together with the people of Israel and worship God. He feels like his soul has been ripped away from the very presence of God. You see, the combination of this psalmist's soul seeking God, like a deer seeks water, and then the psalmist referring to God as the living God, it serves to direct our thoughts to the God who is elsewhere described in Scripture as the fountain of living water. God is and should be to us a fountain of living water. Without this fountain, we wither up and die. Nourishment is found in and comes only from the Lord. Physical nourishment is found in and only comes from the Lord. You may say, well, I work hard to provide physical nourishment for myself. Yet it is God that has given you the ability to do that work. Spiritual nourishment only comes from the Lord, and it is only to Him whom we must come to when we're experiencing droughts in our lives. I wonder if I was to ask you the question this morning, have you ever experienced a time of dryness in your own Christian experience? Who would answer yes? I would think that most of us maybe have experienced that time in our lives, that time where it just seems as if the well has run dry. You see, human nature has often led even God's people to seek nourishment elsewhere, spiritual nourishment, physical nourishment. Human nature has often led people to think that God doesn't provide these things and to look for them elsewhere. An example of this is found in Jeremiah chapter 2. In Jeremiah chapter 2, Jeremiah writes, records, "Be appalled, O heavens, at this be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils." Here are the two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Here in these verses in Jeremiah 2, we read that even God's people can forget, or maybe worse, ignore the fact that God alone is the one who provides complete nourishment. Have you forgotten that God is the source of life? Have you ignored, or are you ignoring to some degree, the fact that God is the very source of life, the one who provides complete nourishment, complete sustenance? But more than a rejection of God here, Jeremiah tells us that God's people have not only rejected God at times, but they've actually actively gone in search of nourishment elsewhere. They have forsaken me, Jeremiah says, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. These cisterns that Jeremiah talks of, they were holes which were dug in the ground, and these holes, they were plastered in such a way that water could enter and be stored in these just massive holes in the ground. They were stored in such a way that the water would not seep out of these holes. And just imagine for a moment, to go back to something I've tried to get you to imagine just a little while ago. Imagine for a moment you're in a part of the world in which there is little to no rain. And on top of that fact that there is little to no rain, there's currently a drought in that part of the world. And you come across one of these cisterns. And you look into this cistern in great anticipation for refreshment, and all you find are cracked walls and dryness. When we seek things other than God for nourishment, it is as if we are turning to these broken cisterns. And so what broken cisterns, or from what broken cisterns at times in your life do you seek nourishment? Do you seek nourishment in your job or your family, spiritual or physical? Do you seek nourishment in your life and some other thing that is not God? Are there times where, almost like the psalmist, you are depending on yourself to sustain yourself through your Christian walk, through your Christian life, through your Christian experience? The psalmist, he had not rejected God. He had not replaced God, but nevertheless, he was still experiencing the drought of being torn away from the presence of God. He was still experiencing the drought of being torn away from joining in the worship of God with God's people. And so he asks the question, when shall I come and appear before God? And this question, it's a desperate question. When shall I come and appear before God? And maybe you're asking a question like that of yourself even right now. You feel so far away from God. Nothing you do is helping. Not even turning to Scripture is helping. And you're crying out in anguish, when shall I come and appear before God? God, when will you reveal yourself to me again? When will you draw me close to yourself again? I need your presence, but I just can't find it, oh God. This question, it's partly rhetorical, to really lay emphasis on the psalmist's longing for God. You see, to this question, there is no ready answer. The psalmist is in exile. He doesn't know when he's going to go back to worship with his people. He doesn't know when he's going to come together with his people to keep the festivals which the Lord has instituted. There is no ready answer to when he will appear before the Lord again. And really, this can be a comfort to us. It doesn't seem like it, but this can be a comfort to those of us who feel distant from God from time to time. Even those of us who feel distant from God right now as we sit and we consider this psalm. You see, sometimes in those times of dryness in our Christian experience, our attitude is something along the lines of, well, just pull yourself together. Just get over it and get on with it. And maybe you've even had someone who has said something along those lines to you. Well, just get over it. But the thing we must remember as Christians is that there are times in our Christian life when God allows us to feel far away from Him, so that we can remember how good He is and how much we actually need Him. That's very important to remember. There are times in our lives where God allows us to feel far away from Him so that we remember how good He is and how much we actually need Him. How much do you feel like you need God this morning? How much do you thirst for the presence of God? How much do you long for that closeness to God this morning? In those times in life when we feel far from God, the example of this psalmist is not pull yourself together, man. No, it's a wholehearted, whole person desire and longing to return to the very presence of the living God. Why? Because as the deer, without the water, the deer will die, and God is the only source of life and wholeness. God is the only source of life and wholeness. And as the psalm ponders his drought, the drought that he's feeling, an absence from God, how does he respond to this? Well, in verse 4, he starts to remember. In verse 4, he deliberately calls to remembrance the times that he has spent in nearness to God, worshipping him. He goes back in his mind to those times of blessing with God's people during the festivals, which they kept in remembrance of all that the Lord had done for them and through them. You see, when this psalmist, whenever he cannot feel the presence of God, he can remember it. And that is the beauty about the Christian life. The Christian life, God identifies with us in our emotions, but God also identifies with us outside of our emotions. He identifies with us in his word, reminding us time and time again that he is the very breath that has breathed life into us. He's the very one who holds each breath, each of our breaths in his hands. The psalmist, when he cannot feel the presence of God, he can remember the presence of God. And as he remembers the presence of God, as he remembers all that he has been able to do and worship for God, he asks another question, which he will ask again 2 more times. And this is how we'll break up Psalm 42 and 43. In verse 5, the psalmist asks himself the question. He's still talking to himself here. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Is there any comfort to be drawn from this question in times when we feel distant from God? Yes. There is comfort to be drawn from this question. And the comfort that we can draw from the psalmist asking this question is this: God understands our experience. God understands our experience. How? That seems like a silly thing to say, Jude, maybe you're thinking. How does God understand our experience in times when we feel lonely, when we feel isolated, when we feel dry, when we feel far away from God? Well, he identifies through his Son, Jesus. Where else do we hear language like this? Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? We hear language like this coming out of the mouth of our Lord Jesus. In John 12, Jesus says, now my soul is troubled. The God-man is saying, now my soul is troubled. In Mark 14, Jesus says, my soul is very sorrowful, even unto death. And in Matthew 27 on the cross, you'll know these very famous words well. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What comfort can be drawn from a downcast soul? From a period of dryness? Well, our Savior knows. Our God understands. For this psalmist, that question was one that followed naturally from the remembrance of God. God has done great things. My hope is in him, and I will wait for his deliverance. The psalmist, he's reminding himself that God is his hope. God himself is his hope. God is still God, even when he feels far away, even when worship is interrupted, even when we feel like we can't come close to him. In another psalm, David writes, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. And that's really the sentiment of this psalm. That's really the sentiment of this psalmist. He knows that one day he will again know the joy of praising God in the congregation of the righteous. And for God's children today, the truth is that no matter how dark or how long the night feels, the night of darkness, or the night of isolation, the night of loneliness, the night of depression, no matter how dark or how long this night feels, joy comes with the morning. No matter how dark your experience has been or even is right now, hope and joy are on the horizon. For the child of God, eternal worship and praise in the very presence of God is what lies ahead. For some of us this morning, we must focus on that hope, that long-term hope, that in the presence of God we will experience joy. Why? Because for some of us here this morning, or for some of us who may even listen to this online this evening, joy and hope are in very short supply in this life. And so we must long for God alone. We must thirst for God alone. We must remember his goodness to us. We must look to him and to his eternal glory and the eternal hope that he holds. Why? Because we're not promised freedom from loneliness and isolation. We're not even promised freedom from that dryness and that drought, those times of drought that we feel. What we are told is that God understands where we are. And just as Jesus said in Matthew 5, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Why? For they shall be filled. If not in this scene of time, they shall be filled in eternity. So I come back this morning in closing to this question that I asked at the start. Are you thirsty for God this morning? Do you understand that he is your life source, physically, spiritually, and eternally? And without him, there is no hope. I don't know if you'll remember it, but I think it was in the 90s. There was a series of ads on the TV from Sprite. So Ivan in our service this morning has already give a plug for Mentos, and I'm going to give a plug in closing for Sprite as well. But just a bit of a disclaimer as I do this, there are other soft drinks out there as well. I am not saying that Sprite is the only soft drink. But you might remember in the 90s, this series of ads on TV from Sprite where the slogan was this: image is nothing, thirst is everything. Obey your thirst. Image is nothing, thirst is everything. Obey your thirst. And I think through this psalm, we can apply that slogan to our Christianity, to our Christian life, to our Christian experience. Thirst is truly everything. Thirst for God. Obey your thirst. Pursue him. Pursue him fully, wholeheartedly, with your whole person, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and eternally. In this hymn that we sung just before, we thought on Psalm 42, there was these lyrics: Christ is calling, find refreshing at the cross of living waters. And maybe for some of us, that's where we need to return to this morning, to the cross, to that fount of blessing, to that fount of spiritual nourishment, to that fount of nourishment for our lives. That we can truly say we are happy because we hunger and thirst after righteousness, because our God is faithful and he will fill us. Amen.